Welcome everyone to this month's EPC Forum. My name is Will Burns and I'm Associate Director of the Energy Policy and Climate Program here, and I'd like to welcome all of you, including those that have not been to a forum before. Today's presentation will be by Paul Joffe, who is Senior Foreign Policy Counsel at the World Resources Institute and focuses on international climate and law and policy issues, including multilateral climate negotiations and bilateral engagement with China and other countries. And his presentation today will focus on equity issues associated with the development of the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, the agreement at the last Framework Convention on Climate Change to develop a universal and legally binding or legally effective emissions reduction agreement from 2020. And he'll discuss some of the issues of formulating that in a way that is both deemed to be equitable and politically palatable in the long term. Paul?
Well, thanks, Will, very much for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to discuss this. I'm going to present to you some thoughts on this subject, and then I'm looking forward to your ideas, because this is a subject on which nobody has the answers. Certainly, we haven't seen the answers yet. So first, to set the scene, imagine that Aristotle, King Solomon, and Lyndon Johnson are on a panel discussion of the role in solving the climate crisis. Aristotle would help us think about what equity is and what its relationship is to justice, law, virtue, and the common good. Solomon would get us to think outside the box about the nature of the problem and how to present alternatives to achieve a fair solution. And LBJ would cut deals with all of you to support Solomon's solution in a way that he could say fits with Aristotle's definition, so he could mobilize the crowd gathering outside this building to ensure success. Somebody in my office, one of my young colleagues, told me I was going to have to tell you who these people are. I assume she meant Lyndon Johnson, but given my generation had somewhat ambivalent views about President Johnson, but there was a recent book, some of you may know, about the third volume in this huge biography by Caro about the good Lyndon Johnson in the civil rights era and his tremendous skills in achieving success there. So we can all brush up on who he was. So anyway, in our contemporary vocabulary, this is some of the skill set we need in order to address equity and its role in solving the climate crisis. Now, just one more vignette as part of setting the scene. To help us think about what justice is, let's consider the puzzle presented by a modern philosopher, Amartya Sen, regarding the three children and a flute about which they are quarreling. Some of you may know this puzzle, but I'll quickly state it for those of you who haven't read Sen's book, The Idea of Justice. Anne says she deserves the flute because she's the only one who can play it. Bob says he deserves the flute because he is the only one of the three who is poor and has no toys. And Carla claims the flute on the grounds that she made it. through painstaking labor. Who is right? So Ann's the only one who can play it. Bob is the only one who is poor, and Carla says she deserves it because she made it. To complicate this example slightly, let's imagine that not only does each child have a different interest, but each comes from a different culture with somewhat different philosophical traditions. Those who remember back to college philosophy class will notice diverse conceptions of justice: utilitarian, equalitarian, libertarian, and of course there are other possibilities. Now, Professor Sen says no one is right in all instances. Each theory may produce injustices in some instances. The best way to make comparative judgments for a given purpose is to consider multiple viewpoints refined by different theories. So that's the scene. Now let's take our panel and these thoughts about justice and consider the climate crisis. This is a talk about shaping an international agreement that will keep greenhouse gas emissions below the level that will produce dangerous climate change, the 2-degree centigrade threshold, above pre-industrial levels. In particular, it's a discussion regarding the role of equity in shaping such an agreement. In the language of the world of climate change negotiations, this is a discussion about CBDR and RC, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And my main theme is on the question of whether equity is part of the problem or part of the solution in confronting the climate crisis, and how to make it the latter. So that's the theme. Here's the problem. The window is closing in the next few years on the opportunity to keep greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will prevent average global temperature from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Scientists say that in passing the 2-degree threshold, we face a probability of dangerous climate change, and that list of damages that is too well known to this group for me to go through it. Rising sea levels, drought, pestilence, etc. You know, sometimes I think I know this is a knowledgeable group here in this room, but sometimes I think we forget to mention, and particularly when we're talking to the general public, even educated people who don't necessarily follow climate the way we do, how impending this is, how urgent it is. It's now a year ago that the International Energy Agency, a very plain vanilla sort of middle-of-the-road international group of number crunchers and green eye shades, said that we have until 2017 to turn the graph significantly downward, that we have, as of now, currently have occupied 80% of the atmospheric space available for carbon emissions. As you know, they stay in the atmosphere for centuries, so there's a limited amount of space left, at which point we will cross the 2-degree threshold. And by 2017, we will have occupied 100% of the space. And from that point going forward, by 2035, we will cross the 2-degree threshold as a result of the emissions that are already up there if we haven't taken serious action by 2017. It's a combination of the fact that they stay in the atmosphere and the infrastructure lock-in due to the building of power generation and other emitters that have a life of decades. So that's sort of a problematic that you don't often see mentioned. Occasionally in the media, somebody will talk about urgency, but that's what we're talking about, just a few years. And we are on track now, assuming that those significant changes are not taken, to go anywhere from 2.6 to 6 degrees by 2100, and that's a fairly conservative estimate. There are those who think it'll go higher. Last December in Durban, South Africa, the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change decided they would work toward a new agreement to be concluded in 2015 that would be implemented beginning in 2020. So you can see we're already out there beyond 2017. The new agreement will be, quote, you probably all know this by heart, a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties, close quote. The Durban Statement recognizes the need for parties to increase their pledges to action and seeks the highest possible effort by all. But the language is famously ambiguous about whether the new agreement will be legally binding. It is also famously silent on the question of equity, the subject of this talk. But since it is stated that the new agreement will be, quote, under the convention, India and others argue that the principle of CBDR is applicable since it is a principle of the convention. Questions and debate regarding equity, of course, have a long history under international agreements relating to environment in general and climate change in particular. Suffice it to say that the key point of departure is the language of Article 3 of the Convention, which states that the parties shall protect the climate system, quote, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Accordingly, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof, close quote. Now, it's been suggested that grounds for differentiation include historic responsibility, the developed countries having been emitting carbon into the atmosphere for many decades, different levels of economic development and capacity, and differing vulnerabilities. However, parties disagree on the grounds which of those criteria should be applied or prioritized, and it has been said that, quote, the nature and extent of treatment in favor of developing countries is actually undefined and remains, quote, a central point of contestation in the climate change negotiations. No surprise there. Thus, the problem. In sharing the responsibilities under a new climate agreement, parties have different ideas about who should do what and who should do how much. They even differ about whether those questions should be decided by a formula or principles derived from an understanding of CBDR, or, for example, whether it should just be a negotiated numbers without equity criteria, in spite of the fact that, as India argues, equity is a principle of the convention. Some developing country parties argue that, at least initially, only developed countries should have legally binding emission reduction commitments and responsibility to provide financial assistance to developing countries for adaptation to climate change, essentially the approach that was taken under the Kyoto Protocol. This stance is often justified based on historical responsibility, the observation that developed countries have generated the majority of greenhouse gas emissions since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. It is also said that there's a certain amount of atmospheric space available before the world crosses that 2-degree threshold, and the developed countries have already more than occupied their share when calculated on a per capita basis. So according to that analysis, developed countries are in the red as far as any right to the atmosphere and need mostly to be compensating developing countries. Many developed countries take a different view. The EU has said that CBDR should be seen as evolving, that equity is a matter of interpretation and should be achieved through negotiations regarding what is acceptable to everybody. And the United States has said equity should not be defined by a formula, that equity has various definitions, and that choosing one would be viewed as unfair and would slow down the negotiations. The U.S. has also said that it could not support a new agreement with a, quote, firewall between developing and developed countries, the idea that only developed countries have responsibilities, obligations, perhaps legally binding obligations. The U.S. negotiators say that developing countries already account for 55% of global emissions, that is, current emissions, and will account for 65% by 2030, with China having already now surpassed the United States. So the U.S. says the content of commitments can be different, but not mandatory on one side and voluntary on the other. Also, the U.S. proposes that countries graduate to take on greater responsibilities based on their stage of development and emissions. Meanwhile, a group of countries called the Alliance for Small Island States, AOSIS, emerged at the Durban conference expressing some frustration with all sides. The Economic Times of India reported that AOSIS joined the European Union to pressure the US, China, and India to accept a mandate for a new agreement covering all major emitters. So it is evident that the main positions regarding equity that I've stated so far are at odds. Thus, the problem of whether and how to solve the equity question is linked to the underlying problem of how to solve the climate problem. The U.S. statement just mentioned hints that the equity argument might slow negotiations. On the other hand, leading developing countries argue that the negotiations can't move at all unless the equity debate is resolved, so that those making commitments know that the burdens will be determined based on fair sharing. In this view, equity is an enabler of ambition. At the same time, ambition also influences the discussion of equity. So equity affecting ambition, also the reverse. Parties do not wish to define equity without progress on understanding what is the long-term goal, how big is it, and the amount of burden that is to be shared out. If the burdens were less, perhaps equity would be less of a sticking point. But the burdens are daunting. Sivan Kartha of the Stockholm Environmental Institute explains that given the temperature constraint, Many developing countries will have to reduce their emissions before they have developed sufficiently to deal with mass poverty. This difficulty helps explain why the equity issue also involves intense debate about who should provide how much financial and technological assistance to enable poor countries to both grow and take climate action. So he is acknowledging that certainly some developing countries are now big emitters, and his point is that they're going to have to restrict those emissions before they've dealt with extensive poverty. And so that simply comes back to the question of, is there going to be some sort of finance or other assistance from the advanced countries? The problem is that under the circumstances, the impasse over equity is an impasse in making progress on addressing climate change. Equity and ambition are terms in a simultaneous equation, so to speak. A spokesman for AOSIS, which is concerned with the urgent task, for obvious reasons, of preventing sea level rise, summed up the problem this way, noting that there is no agreement on the definition of equity. The representative from Trinidad and Tobago said that, quote, equity cannot be achieved if some of us cease to exist. So the context was sort of expressing frustration about the deadlock over equity. So that brings me to sort of the meat of the discussion, which is about breaking the deadlock. And I'd like to just give a little bit of mention here of a new initiative that the World Resources Institute is taking in partnership with the Mary Robinson Foundation. We've launched the Climate Justice Dialogue, is what we call it, to find a way out of this impasse. The dialogue will work with partners around the world to enhance ambition and equity across all the building blocks of the climate regime, with a view to shaping the 2015 agreement. It will be based on regional and national dialogues, commissioned papers, a major flagship report, and development of a narrative around climate justice to push for greater urgency, equity, and ambition. I hope that people like you here will be interested in engaging in that. Let me know today or in the future your ideas and availability to participate in further discussions and perhaps analysis. What I'd like to do now is start us thinking about how to recast the equity discussion so it is not a source of deadlock, but a means for getting on track to solving the climate crisis. So first, let's be clear that there already is differentiation in the climate regime and the climate negotiations. We know from the pledges already made that there's generally a tacit assumption that absolute economy-wide reduction targets are appropriate for developed countries, while reductions from business as usual, BAU so-called, are more appropriate for developing countries, with even less systematic policies and measures for the less developed developing countries. Likewise, it's understood that there should be differentiation in finance with a gradation of responsibilities from most to least developed. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that countries seem so far to be unwilling to consider criteria for increased ambition. whether due to past conduct or future economic development. Instead, countries seem to be insisting on retaining commitments without criteria, or else they simply disagree over the criteria. In other words, we've now, as of the state of play right now, is we've got these self-selected targets, the so-called pledge system, and we are, the world is something like 4 to 6 gigatons. There's a gap of 4 to 6 gigatons between the pledges and what's needed based on a sort of optimistic read. Many argue that we need legally binding commitments in the next phase to what the commitments would be. But as I've said, the sticking point is that there's no agreement, there's no consensus on how the burdens should be shared to go beyond just self-selected pledges. And I think you can separate out the issue of what the pledges should be from the issue of whether there should be a binding agreement. And countries seem so far to have been unwilling to codify even the existing principles of differentiation that I mentioned a minute ago in a legally binding agreement. In fact, the reluctance and disagreement over the criteria may be a large part of why countries seem reluctant to enter a legally binding agreement. So to illustrate how the climate justice dialogue might help us address this impasse, I'm going to suggest 3 examples that call on the different skills of our climate panel, comprised of Solomon, LBJ, and Aristotle. So the first example is to use a little Solomonic wisdom to redefine the problem. Much of the paralysis is over mitigation. Who should do how much to reduce carbon emissions? So the first possibility is to solve the problem by enlarging it. Let's talk about deconstructing equity across all the building blocks of the climate negotiations. This means not only mitigation, but adaptation and finance and technology and other means of implementation. Now, I know those things are all out there to begin with, but the point is to look at all of these things together when we talk about equity. There may be pluses and minuses on any given one of them. Perhaps it could even involve other related negotiating forums, such as the World Trade Organization or the Sustainable Development Goals discussion that emerged from Rio +20. The point is to create an overall package that is seen as fair so that one issue does not have to bear all the weight. In putting the package together, it might be easier if we remember the puzzle of the flute and not try to satisfy one abstract theory of justice, but consider multiple perspectives. So if my first suggestion for breaking the deadlock over equity is to look for a bigger package deal, my second suggestion is that we think like LBJ working on civil rights and motivate parties with a range of different incentives. So Johnson was famous for appealing to every constituency based on what could move them. Equity remains a crucial part of the solution, but we need to consider other factors that condition equity. One place to look is to the benefits of action, both to avoid damage and to achieve economic, health, energy security, and other benefits. the dynamic in which countries say they will only carry out the inadequate pledges so far made is in part because some see little or no benefit from doing any more. And this is where it's important to look to the examples of players that are moving ahead of the pack, whether it's Mexico or Germany or, yes, even California. These leaders individually and perhaps working together can show that the calculations of self-interest that led to unambitious pledges are mistaken, that there actually is something to gain in taking this action. A big issue that we sometimes forget about, that it's all sharing pain, but there is another side to that story. A third example we might talk about is how improving the climate regime framework can help us, improving the framework. With Aristotle, we might ask, what is the relationship between law and justice? Again, with our Aristotle hat on, or maybe it's maybe the right metaphor is with our Aristotle robe on, let's ask, what is the nature of an international legal agreement? And why does anyone want a legally binding agreement? In fact, there are several aspects to the legal character of an international agreement. Yes, there is the expression of intent to be bound, which is the sine qua non of a binding agreement. But there is also the mandatory or voluntary character of the commitments, the prescriptiveness of commitments, that is, the specificity. And there are the institutions and mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement. So even before having achieved agreement to be bound, the other aspects of legal character of the agreement can be strengthened. For example, when we say that everyone is taking action, so let's move forward, we need to ask ourselves, how do we know that everyone is taking action? Reluctance of the parties to enter a legally binding climate agreement is heightened if parties lack confidence that they know what other countries are doing. And that is on all aspects of the agreement. So we talk about monitoring emissions, but there's also the issue of monitoring and accounting for financial assistance. So it's not just what is another country doing with respect to its emissions. It's also what financial donor countries are doing on finance. So we will know those answers better and heighten the confidence if we strengthen the institutions for monitoring and follow-up. Other ways we might gain confidence that countries are taking action is if commitments are clarified and written in mandatory language. Conditions are removed and actions are embodied in domestic law. So we had a binding treaty, the UN Framework Convention, and yet it had very weak teeth. That's a technical legal term. Very weak provisions, even though it was binding. So how much did the bindingness get us? And the point is to pay attention to those kinds of issues, mandatory language versus soft voluntary language, specificity versus vagueness. So by strengthening all elements of legal character, we can make a legally binding agreement more likely. Moreover, by working simultaneously to enhance equity and the benefits of action and strengthen the elements of legal character, we may increase the likelihood that an agreement that is legally binding will have strong provisions that will produce results in the real world. So let me try to sort of sum this up a bit. under the heading of what a fair and effective deal might look like. A fair, effective, legally binding international agreement at a level of ambition that will avoid dangerous climate change is what many people who are worried about climate change would like. But we've seen how disagreements over equity and calculations of interest are obstacles to this result. We need ingenuity on both counts to achieve real progress. So far, we have rough differentiation on the nature of commitments, but reluctance by many parties to raise ambition, at least in part because of the deadlock over equity. It's often said that there are trade-offs between and among equity, ambition, and wide participation. But our task is to make progress on all three. One way to think about this is to ask how we can make it easier to do that. What I've suggested, just as examples to get us thinking, is that we might redefine the equity issue, consider it in relation to other factors and incentives, and think about the legal framework for action. So first, looking beyond mitigation, we can ask ourselves how a larger package gives us more options for a deal that will be seen as fair. Second, we already have the beginnings of a demonstration of the benefits of action in certain countries or subnational units like California. What can be done to strengthen these and scale them up? And third and finally, we can consider not only the benefits of a binding agreement, but improving all the elements of legal character, and by that means make an eventual binding agreement more likely and more effective because there will be greater confidence about that agreement. So the test in 2015 will be whether agreement results in a dramatic change for the better that is needed in the real world. Before we reach 2015, we need a dynamic in which countries are drawn together toward meaningful action because they see action as fair, beneficial, and effective, not because they want to save face by signing some empty accord. To mobilize such ideas and measures, we've launched at WRI, we've launched the outreach project we call the Climate Justice Dialogue. And we hope people here and others like you will be interested in it and perhaps participate. Beyond helping to improve analysis, we hope to contribute to recognition that climate change is a human and justice issue that will help generate a domestic call in countries worldwide for sustained climate action. We seek this as part of the wider vocabulary of arguments based on science, economics, and other considerations. We look forward to working with any of you who are interested. It would be hard to find a more challenging or more important topic. And, as I was thinking about sort of what note to end a talk of this kind on, I was thinking about how this issue really opens up so many questions, big questions, not just about justice, but how how international relations work, how the international system works, and what is broken in our domestic political system that this issue is so absent from public debate right now. So those are probably questions for several more fora. But with respect to today's topic, I'm very interested in hearing thoughts that any of you may have, and I'll stop it right there.
Thanks. For you. So you were talking about how the U.S. is reluctant to have an agreement that's not binding for all parties as far as commitments go. one of the big issues I've noticed through readings and everything is that even if the U.S. agrees to something, that has to go through the Congress to be approved. Do you see that being an issue, even if there was an agreement saying, okay, all parties have commitments and they have to go legally binding, and the U.S. says, great, we're going to go for it. Do you see that being a problem passing through Congress right now in the future?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, we should remember that the UN Framework Convention itself is a treaty that, in fact, was ratified by the Senate during the administration of the first George Bush. So while the conventional wisdom is that the Senate doesn't ratify treaties, it occasionally does. This is obviously harder because the Senate was unwilling to take up, and therefore you could say there was unwillingness to move forward on the substance of a comprehensive climate legislation that would have set up the kinds of commitments that are needed under. So I think until we see the consensus developing to support legislation, a treaty that does essentially the same thing would be unlikely, to say the least, unrealistic. And of course, there is a difference between what's needed to pass legislation and what's needed to ratify a treaty. So yes, there are significant problems there. On the other hand, we need to think about, this is maybe thinking too far down the road. We need to develop the support for the substance first, but why not? This is a seminar, right? There is the possibility that if countries are taking the domestic action and embodying that action in domestic law, that it could be done under an agreement that doesn't amount to a full binding treaty. So there are all kinds of ways, variations, ways in which things could move forward. There's an interesting precedent for that in that the Congress initially rejected the International Trade Organization way back in the 1940s. It was sort of vaguely a forerunner to what's now the WTO. And yet the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the trade negotiations went forward, and individual trade deals over the years were agreed to, and progress was made on that, and eventually the WTO came to be and was approved by Congress, not through the treaty process. That's another interesting point. But legislation was passed to approve the U.S. participation in the WTO. So I think that would be my sense on it for the moment. Yes?
Isn't the BirdHegel resolution explicitly saying that a president cannot sign an international treaty without actually giving evidence to Congress that such a treaty does not hurt the U.S. economy, and under the condition that only other countries sign up to similar commitments?
Well, I mean, it was a Senate resolution which doesn't have legally binding force.
Oh, I didn't know that. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's obviously a sentiment that everyone knows is a factor in Senate attitudes when something else comes up subsequently, in any future circumstance. It's interesting that Senator Byrd himself, who, as everybody knows, is now deceased, but in his later years, talked more about the need to take climate action. And the Senate has said various other things in resolutions over the years about the need for climate action. When Senator McCain was pushing climate legislation, everybody always reverts back to BirdHegel, but there have been subsequent expressions of views. But still in all, at the end of the day, the type of issues that were raised in that resolution about other countries taking action and the impact on the U.S. economy, those were the two issues in BirdHegel, are still out there. But there wasn't anything terribly specific in that resolution on those points. So it is a part of the debate, but it's not in any sense legally binding. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Right, all the way back. You, sir.
Yeah, really sort of a question and a comment on context going back to your earlier remarks about 2017 and overshoot. I think that a very credible argument could be made at the moment that we have in fact already overshot. If you look at the most recent sea ice data, you'll see that the observed sea ice decrease is way below the standard deviation, below the average predicted by the models. And that, if you look at the mean of the model prediction, that puts us about 40 years ahead of schedule in terms of climate impacts. So I would think that that changes the negotiating context somewhat and adds potentially a sense of urgency if a recognition is there that is a sort of externality pushing things forward.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I should hasten to say that almost everything that I've said, there are views about the science. There are views that it's worse. That in fact the danger point is 1.5 degrees, not 2 degrees. As you say, that we've already passed the threshold. Yes. So, and these things are stated in probabilities. If we agree that it's 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, it's about probabilities, and there is the possibility of bad things happening even at those temperatures. And in our normal lives, we take out insurance against much greater improbabilities than what we're talking about here. So yeah, I accept that friendly amendment.
I'll let you
Oh,
I had a question.
Oh, sorry.
I think your analogy with Aristotle and Solomon and all is commendable. I think to think about the whole notion of expanding the problem, that it may be more tractable. So only bringing the politicians like Lyndon Johnson in who can finagle more deals because there are more degrees of freedom in the bargaining there. And that seems like a contradistinction to the approach that the previous administration was using, where you had multiple bilateral agreements with the major emitters. And the argument was made that was the more tractable negotiation opportunity. But those are really the ones that you need to influence to make a difference in things. And so we really concentrated on those. And of course the combinatorics of trying to reach agreements there that, not spill your hand or reveal your hand in negotiations with others, even in that small group, are challenging enough. And was unsuccessful ultimately. Are there any analogies that you can point to, any examples you can point to where this notion at the international scale, the kind of problem we're dealing with here, where that notion of expanding it to even higher dimensional problems has led to success?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are often package deals in trade negotiations. Another example would be the expansion of the European Union, where at various points, people here who are more closely familiar with the history of the EU, but at various points, different pieces were put together into package deals. The agriculture provisions for France and accession of East European countries, support for raising environmental standards in return for those countries getting access to the common market. But you raise a point which I want to just comment on. There is a lot of, I don't want to suggest that there's consensus about procedure going forward. There's a lot of debate about this. There are serious students of this process who think that negotiating with 193 countries is too cumbersome, and that the word that's being used now is that there ought to be small clubs that could make deals to make progress without the cumbersome nature of and I think part of the notion is that in a smaller grouping, there's more likely to be confidence that various quid pro quo scenarios will be carried out. Technology assistance, market access for technology, et cetera. I think on the other side of that debate is the point that at least you need the major emitters, that you've still got a collective action problem. So if you get some portion of the major emitters, there's still going to be the kind of BirdHegel reluctance that, what's going to happen if our competitors are not doing this. And once you get into once the grouping is that big, then the question is, what is going to be the dynamic as far as assistance to the countries that, is it possible or even likely that the big guys will cut a deal that's detrimental to the weaker and poorer countries? So they'll agree to some mitigation targets that they're happy with, but which essentially the island states are disappearing. So that's the other side of the debate.
You referred to the Durban platform, which in its wording, as I at least read it, would seem to have been a small advance because it did have this phrase, and some future agreement should include all countries or something to that effect. Do you happen to know much about the negotiating history of including that phrase, and how was that possible to get in there?
The phrase about including all countries? Well, there are others in the room who may know as much or more than I, but my colleagues were, I was not in Durban, my colleagues were there. I felt like I was in Durban because I was, in cyberspace, I was in Durban. But the United States was pushing for that, all countries, as something to show the Congress that, it responds to the old BirdHegel. But the issue is, what are they all there for? Remember that under the Framework Convention itself, all countries are there, and yet it talks about developed countries taking the lead, and under the Framework Convention, there came the Kyoto Protocol, which created what the U.S. negotiators call a firewall about developed versus. So I think there was some hope, or at least the U.S. negotiators tried to say that this had sort of crossed a line in the sand, and at last all countries are saying they will take on commitments. The U.S., as I indicated in my talk, recognizing that they may be different levels of ambition, but that all countries would be taking them on. But in the aftermath of Durban, there has continued to be discussion about, by some countries, saying that, I think India is an example, that we should not, at this point, have to necessarily, I think the necessarily meaning it depends on what this looks like, but have mandatory commitments. So I guess the answer is it's not clear how far we've come, how much progress that actually reflected.
I want to have the second part, if I may. I know you follow China, and the Chinese position in the eyes of some has become a little bit more positive, but I wonder if you could describe your perception of that in terms of Chinese participation in the future.
Sure. It's not crystal clear, but the Chinese came to Durban saying things that sounded more like they might be willing eventually, that is in 2015, to sign a legally binding agreement. But they had a lot of conditions on that. And I'd have to go back and check, but I think just as an example, and I think this is right, they were saying there would have to be enough progress from the developed countries in terms of the level of ambition of the developed countries. And there were a number of other conditions. So on the one hand, there's ambiguity there as to where exactly the line would be drawn by the Chinese. On the other hand, the Chinese are taking action. It's in their 12th five-year plan, continued reduction in carbon intensity, continued increase in renewable energy. They're famously moving forward on wind and solar, and they have shut down a lot of their inefficient small coal plants. New coal plants that are going in are only state-of-the-art. They're building many of these things into domestic law. And it's because they see it in their own interest in various ways. I mean, they've made clean energy one of the priority industries under the 12th five-year plan, and Chinese leadership has said things that indicates, and I say this to explain what I mean by they see it in their own interests, not only because they are beginning to see that they will be hit hard by climate change in terms of agriculture and the seacoast and so on, but they see low carbon technology as an area in which they can excel. In other areas, they realize that other countries have been out there for many decades ahead of them, but in this area, they're at least even and in some aspects leading. So they see economic benefit and incentive there. So that's what I guess I would say about while everybody has their ambiguities about when they will agree to a binding legally binding agreement, there are some positive things about what's happening in China.
I want to pick it right up where you just left it. I spent most of my career so far exactly on international negotiations. I'm doing very different stuff now. And the reason why is because while I do believe, and I'm going again to the COP this year, I do believe that this is important and it's the forum where we get together and we check in with each other, what are you doing? I do not believe anymore in this force by a very wise man called the European project of social democratization of world politics that I was a great supporter of, but that just didn't make it. And the reason I think why, obviously it's big two elephants in the room that have more or less a mutual veto, which is China and the United States. And these countries can't or don't move for certain reasons, I think. And that's where I'm picking up with China. I think the reason why China moves is because obviously they have a political system that allows it to do it. Whereas here in the United States you have so many veto players that don't allow the government to move on, even if it wants. Like I think most of us would give this administration credit for, that they did want to move, but there was strong resistance from Congress and they couldn't get the comprehensive climate and energy legislation through Congress here at home, and they couldn't make more commitments internationally. So why is this? A political system, constructivists would say there's some norms that are in the way, I mean, now this debate is all about lowering taxes. I don't see anybody raising their hand and say, like, let's increase taxes, let's increase the role of government, let's fight for the environment here. That's obviously in the way. And then the third reason that I always underestimate and that I really have just come to see very recently is that there are what realists or neorealists or neoliberalists would call, hard politics causes. And I'm talking specifically about energy here. And you do have countries, like most European countries outside of Russia, like South Korea, of course, like Japan, of course, but also India and China, that are running out of fossil fuels very, very quickly. So, in addition to the paradigm shift, I think that you have described, Paul, where you absolutely rightly so, that you see in certain countries, it's somewhat absurd. You have the international negotiations for 20 years, where it's about the whole game is about how can I possibly give up less than you, okay? That's the whole negotiation. Whereas in our countries, we're talking about green economies, green jobs, how sustainable lifestyles are happier lifestyles. How there's a whole paradigm shift that I don't think is reflected yet in the international negotiation. So don't want to talk too long, but we did some back of the envelope calculations for India and China, and in both countries it's very clear that they're running out of at least what's considered cheap coal very, very quickly. And we're talking not about hundreds, we're not talking about 50s, we're probably rather talking about 20 to 30 years. Okay, so they don't have too much of a choice to transition, in addition to these paradigm changes that we have described. So my question then is for you, the situation in the United States, quite frankly, is different. I mean, you have a lot of gas, shale gas, there's a lot of coal, you have Canada on the northern border with a lot of oil, now, the leading oil country in the world. So that situation is very different from that in other countries. So I guess two questions. One, what do you think about reflecting is there a chance to, I don't know how else to put it, these paradigm shifts in the climate negotiations, or do you rather suggest keep it out of it? Climate negotiations are complicated enough, should be about climate. We leave this to the Clean Energy Ministerial or the G20 or the other groups that are trying to kind of positively promote technological change.
Well, what would it look like to have it in the UN? I think to some extent it already is. So I'm just wondering what you're thinking about.
So maybe the second question gets closer to this actually. So in addition to the three different scenarios that you outlined, there might be a fourth one, and you started with deconstructing the negotiations that have become so complicated and that are pretty much about everything now, from forestry to energy, technology exchange, land use change, and So instead of trying to address all of these topics, how about picking some of them out where you think this is really where the international negotiations can make the biggest impact? So I'm talking specifically about least developed countries and support for adaptation in least developed countries. I'm talking about areas, for example, RED, where so reduced emissions from deforestation. How where it seems like we're relatively close to a deal, but because of this package deal, we're not making we're not putting the signature on the paper because there's so many other things attached to it. Maybe that gets more to my question of mitigation, leaving that possibly aside. It's really not what I want. I mean, I'm not arguing this case. I'm just depressed with the little progress we have made. And so many.
Well, I think a lot of people are thinking that we need to explore different combinations, different scenarios. I think the phrase you hear is variable geometry. I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking of RED. That's the forest issue. I think a lot of the proponents of that, whether it's governments or foundations or NGOs and the countries themselves, have sort of had the same idea that you have, which is, let's single out this issue and work on it. And I think there are these sort of consortia that are going forward. And I think that as progress is made on some of these issues in smaller groups, it needs to be, hopefully it could be brought back to the UNFCCC with the possibility of the package being assembled. The problem is that the shortness of time. So, I mean, if this was an ordinary issue, it would go forward probably in the way you describe. I mean, the trade regime is one example. There are probably others. It evolved over several decades, and but that's certainly a rational and sensible way to proceed, is to try to see if progress can be made on some of these individual issues. But I do think they need to be linked. Yes?
Maybe was there somebody who didn't in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess my question / statement is more along the lines of, as you had said, stepping back and maybe looking at it in a different way. Because I wonder that with the COP coming up, COP18 coming up, there is growing pessimism over just even this idea of the UNFCCC and how effective it is. So I'm curious to know your thoughts about maybe approaching it from a different way. As in Rio +20, there was a lot of individual commitments and pledges rather than on the international level. So what are your thoughts on this idea of maybe doing a bottom-up, where you're educating and encouraging local solutions or individual solutions, and then once there's that baseline surge, maybe then governments will be more motivated to actually come together and make solutions because they see their own citizens calling for action.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that, because it relates to Alex's question too, and another thought I had. I mean, one answer to that, sort of a little bit of a flippant answer, is that that's sort of what we're doing. That ever since Copenhagen, it's been, and with the expiration of Kyoto, that we've moved out of the realm of legally binding into the realm of pledges, which is sort of bottom up in that sense. Now, you may mean more bottom up in the sense of civil society and grassroots engagement, and there are a lot of folks talking about how, you know, that's needed and necessary to motivate governments. Just to give you another perspective on this, I mean, I have a colleague who says that the UNFCCC has produced some good results that would not have happened without it. It just hasn't produced, you know, the really comprehensive binding agreement that everybody had hoped going into Copenhagen. But that a lot of things are happening, for example, on the technology front, that have been prompted by discussions and even the beginnings of stimulation from the multilateral process around technology. There's some things there that remain to be made operational, I know, on the technology front. But just as an example, you know, if you think about it, without, maybe it's really sounds very minimalist, but without the meeting place, so to speak, of the UNFCCC, some of these things wouldn't have been and wouldn't be happening. That's way short of the high hopes that that we had, and I would certainly not say we should settle for merely sort of a meeting place, but it is doing some things. The other point that this colleague makes is that when people say that we should, top down has failed, so we need to do bottom up, his comment is that we've been doing bottom up and it's not working that well because we've got this huge gigaton gap that needs to be closed, and so we need to be working towards a binding agreement in 2015 because the complete self-selected pledges is not enough. I guess my sense is that there's a very excellent, some very excellent work and writing being done by Professor Lavanya Rajamani in India, whose articles you can find online. She is working on talking about the steps towards a binding agreement. So maybe initially there would be COP decisions or a politically binding agreement like we had in Copenhagen, but farther along in terms of what the level of commitments would be. Country domestic implementation, so these things would start to get embodied in domestic law, and then when countries saw that everybody is doing what they're saying they're doing, and you would have a strong monitoring system. So you wouldn't yet quite have the binding agreement, but you would have countries doing more, you would have strong monitoring, countries would begin to get confidence that other countries are acting, and that would tee it up more for a binding agreement. I'm not saying that Lavanya is, you know, advocating or not advocating that. She's laying out sort of different scenarios, and I think that's one that maybe gets at what you're talking about.
And we can maybe answer this later, sorry for a thought, but I'm curious then, in going into Doha, what would be viewed as the success? I know the past two, we've been iffy. So I'm curious, you know, the outlook right now, what would be deemed as a success for the upcoming COP?
Well, I mean, remember that we're working towards 2015, so we don't expect what we'd like in 2015 to happen in Doha. But we'd like to see significant progress, and from the developing country perspective, there's the second commitment period on the Kyoto Protocol, which is a very sort of concrete expectation, and it's an important quid in the quid pro quo of further progress towards 2015. So Kyoto, the second commitment period on Kyoto is one aspect of Doha. And the rest is there's a somewhat complicated debate over finishing up the long-term cooperative action track that under the convention in order to sort of move all the discussion into the new Durban platform negotiations looking towards 2015. So this gets to be a little esoteric for those who don't follow this every day, but it's a concern to developing countries, for example, that the issues that they have on the table in the LCA discussions don't just get wiped off the slate as we move forward towards working on the Durban platform. So there's going to be sort of a bit of a struggle over that. But I think the short answer is there are, apart from Kyoto, there are the remaining issues of mitigation targets, adaptation, technology, and RED, forests, and the issue of financial assistance. Financial assistance is, for all of those things, financial assistance is obviously a difficult issue in the midst of a global slowdown, and for the United States, with a struggling economy. So it's a challenging environment. I think what we'd like to see is progress on all of those fronts. The big ones are the mitigation target commitments and finance, the beginnings of what is it going to look like in 2015. But part of our work is to work with the individual countries in the hopes that progress, that's sort of been brought up and implied in a number of different questions in the course of this discussion, is if countries see themselves with opportunities domestically, it makes the international negotiations a little bit easier.
I have a question about contraction and convergence, which is an approach that, in my mind, embodies the per capita equity idea. So the question is, who gets the flute? You would cut the flute in 3 parts and give it a part to everyone. So contraction and convergence, all the countries converge towards per capita equity at some point in the future, and then everyone contracts after that, I guess. And so I was wondering if that concept has been brought up a lot in your dialogues around climate justice and equity, or I know there's maybe other proposals that are variations on a theme. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes. That is one of the proposals that's out there. There are a fair number of proposals that work around the issue of per capita allocation of the remaining space, and tendency sort of in the tendency has been that the developing country stance is that it should not only be per capita, but that you start measuring the carbon budget and the responsibility is shared out based on historic contribution to emissions. So if you start the clock in, let's say, 1900, it means that the emissions that people in developed countries are attributed to developed countries are very large, and so the debate has sort of deadlocked over how you calculate what that responsibility is. Do you attribute emissions going back to 1900 or whatever the date might be? Now, negotiators are beginning to point out that before long, countries like China, China, I shouldn't say countries like China, China will have historic, if you add together the emissions that are projected, they will begin to match per capita emissions for say the European Union by, say, 2025. I'm not sure of the number offhand, but within the foreseeable future. So some of these, and there are there's a lot of argument about, is it really fair to attribute those emissions, in a period of time when people were not aware of the problem of climate change? Is per capita the best way to do it? I've seen a suggestion that, okay, and there are various proposals to take into account several factors. So it's not only historic emissions, but it's also capabilities. And one proposal has been to look at the energy intensity of an economy as a proxy for whether the country is working hard enough to reduce its emissions. So if a country is operating very inefficiently and has a high level of energy intensity, that might be weighed against the fact that it has a very low historic emissions. Yet another factor is vulnerability. So this comes back to the flute discussion. The countries that may have, they may be the island states, or they may, like Bangladesh, have great vulnerability to sea level rise, etc. So it's exactly how to weigh all of those. Oh, and yet another is why do we? Another question that is raised sometimes is why do we do it by? Why do we allocate responsibility just according to nations? What about the difference in wealth within the nation? So how to weigh all these different factors has obviously been very difficult and produced a deadlock, because countries come to the negotiations with their version of the flute that, leaves them paying the least or less. That's been part of the difficulty, and it's why, but still, I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a major part of the discussion. And if you went online, there was a thick report from the BASIC experts group. Everybody knows who the BASICs are. It's that group of large developing countries from last fall, I think it's about a year ago, stating their positions on, so it's not official government positions, but it lines up pretty well with it. And it's along the lines of historic responsibility, per capita emissions, etc. So there's, it's a big part of the debate.
One last question.
Yeah, last question. I'm from physics department, actually, University of Maryland. So I just wanted to inject a little bit of kind of physics or hard science perspective. I was a little bit surprised that there were no slides and no data, no plots shown, because WRI is a great source of data, and actually it's a fabulous source of data.
That's an eccentricity of mine.
Yeah, that's fine. But we use this data, we plotted this data, and there are some interesting aspects. Yeah, we don't have time, but answering some of this question, for example, contraction and convergence, one issue. I mean, there is some maybe hope that the world will become more homogeneous, maybe space will be more equal, etc. This comes to eradicating poverty. That's another issue which was going on for 50 more years. Poverty is still there. So the point is, physics has, we plotted this data, and amazingly, we plotted basically distribution, basically probability distribution, or Lorentz curves or whatever, energy consumption per capita, and they follow a certain curve, certain very actually simple mathematical function that follows from maximization of entropy. That is what we use in statistical physics. And the point is that related to this aspect, that it basically general mathematical principle, if you have a complicated, stochastic, kind of random system, and there is partition of a limited resource. So in other words, there is a resource, could be energy or could be money, if it's financial and so on, and this resource in principle can be divided equally between participants. That's possible, that's fluid. It's possible to divide food equally. However, it's extremely improbable, because that kind of division has very low entropy. Much more probable division is highly unequal, described by exponential function, because that has maximal entropy. Okay, and that's in fact what actually data seem to show. And yes, the inequality of energy consumption per capita, Gini coefficient, actually has decreased according to WRI data we used the last 20 years. It decreased from like 56% to 51%. But I don't think it's going to zero. I mean, the equality actually, I think it's going to 50%, which is the number predicted by this maximization of entropy, division of limited resource principle. Anyway, I'll be happy to show you the data, and I have them in the computer, etc. And also maybe contribute a little bit to this discussion of this climate justice project, because we need to understand what's going on. Yeah, maybe there's one injection. There was a talk by Joe Stiglitz, some other foreign sports, but RFF. He's big on inequality, etc. It's greatly simplifying, because it's like the message was something like, if you reduce inequality, it will help us to solve other problems, etc. But the point is, it may not be possible. So reducing inequality hits against this entropic issue. Okay, and that needs to be understood, because that is the origin of that issue. Okay, so anyway, maybe I'll be happy to discuss more.
Do you have anything in writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I have papers. Yes, I have a paper.
I'll give you my card.
Yes, I have a few actually printed copies, or hard copies, and also I would be happy to exchange cards and so on.
Good. And I extend that invitation to anyone. Be happy to keep in touch. View this as just the beginning of conversation, and the ideas that have come out here today are helpful to me. I think every time we have this discussion, it helps us to think about it. So I really appreciate that, Will, and appreciate your setting this up.